He was dying. The man who had spent his entire life studying what happens inside the human psyche suddenly saw something he never expected to see. Something that shook even him. A man who was nearly impossible to shake. Carl Gustav Jung, the greatest psychologist of the 20th century. And there he lay, seeing. And what he was seeing, so far outside any scientific theory that even he didn't know what to call it. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly what he saw, what he understood, and why his last words are not the words of a dying old man. They are a warning. Personally, to you. Stay until the end, because the most important part isn't at the beginning. But first, one fact most people don't know. Jung didn't just think about death, he lived through it. Back in 1944, 17 years before his actual death, he broke his leg, which was followed by a heart attack. His heart stopped, and in those minutes, he left. Didn't die, but went far enough to see what only a handful of people ever see, and come back as someone different. Here is what he described. He saw himself in space, high above the earth, below, a blue sphere, around him, absolute silence, and in that silence, a massive, dark monolith, a rock, suspended in the void. In it, an entrance, a temple, and Jung knew, with the kind of certainty that only exists at the threshold of death, that inside, every answer to every question of his life was waiting for him. Every single one. He walked toward that entrance, and he was happy in a way he had never been happy in 80 years of living. He wrote afterward, "It was a feeling of absolute completeness, as though every fragment of his existence, every thought, every mistake, every love, had gathered into a single point and become whole." And then he was right at the entrance. One more step. And in that moment he was stopped. The image of his doctor appeared, and that image said, "Go back. It's not time." Jung described what he felt in that second, and it is not what you would expect from a great humanist and philosopher. He felt rage, real rage, because he had been pulled away from the door behind which everything existed. When he came to in the hospital room, he felt no relief. He felt loss. He wanted to go back. Remember this moment, because this is where everything worth hearing actually begins. But here is what almost nobody knows about the weeks after he returned. Jung fell into a deep depression. Not from pain, not from illness, from the fact that he was here again, among the living, in a body, in a limited world. He told his daughter, "What was there? Compared to it, our entire earthly existence feels like a rough draft. Not a bad rough draft, but a draft, something unfinished, preparatory." And every time someone came to his hospital room with flowers and a cheerful, "How wonderful that you survived," he looked at them with quiet bewilderment. Because from his point of view, surviving was the loss. And dying would have been the gain. It was something else entirely. It was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that permanently rearranges every priority you have. After this experience, Jung changed, not on the outside, on the inside. He began speaking about things he had previously only hinted at, and the most important thing he said, "It's not about light and peace, it's about something far more uncomfortable." He said, "What is waiting for you after death is determined by you. Not God, not fate, not a list of your sins. You, by what you have built inside yourself over the course of your entire life." And right here, most people relax, and because they think, "Well, I'm basically a decent person. I've never killed anyone, so everything will be fine." But Jung was not talking about that, not even close. His entire professional life he studied what he called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself, everything you hide. The envy you call righteous indignation, the fear you call caution, the cruelty you call high standards, the years of resentment you call silence. Jung said, every person has a shadow, and it goes nowhere. It lives, it accumulates, and it, listen carefully, it comes with you, across every border, including the last one. Not because someone is punishing you, but because it is part of your consciousness, and consciousness crosses over completely, with all of its contents, like a suitcase you've been packing your whole life, and carry with you into whatever comes next. And this is where Jung asked the question that made most of his patients go silent for several minutes. He would ask, imagine that tomorrow is the crossing, literally tomorrow. What is in your suitcase? Not what you wish were in it, not what you plan to put in it someday. What is actually in it right now, tonight. And people would start to think, and they would become uncomfortable, because suddenly it turned out there were things in there they had never consciously examined, things they had been carrying for years, for decades, automatically. And Jung would say that is the real work, not prayers, not rituals, not good deeds performed for an audience. This, the quiet, painful, deeply unromantic work of looking at what's actually in your suitcase while there is still time. Now, a real story, not theory. A story Jung described himself, one of his patients, successful, respected, outwardly flawless. Everyone around him considered him a model human being. No one knew that inside. There were years of suppressed rage, narcissism hidden behind generosity, cruelty toward the people closest to him, which he called having high standards. He never looked at any of this directly. Never once. This man died suddenly, and his wife, and within a few weeks, began to feel his presence in the house, but not warm, not comforting, heavy, suffocating, as though he hadn't left, but was suspended, right between two worlds, unable to move forward. Jung explained this without any mysticism. A person who spent their entire life avoiding a meeting with themselves arrives in the post-death state and for the first time in all of eternity, is completely alone with what they were running from and doesn't know what to do because they never learned. This isn't hell. It's worse than hell. It's you and your own psyche. No exit, no distraction, forever. Now, a different story. Because Jung was never a man of fear alone. One of his colleagues, a psychologist who had undergone deep personal analysis, who had spent his whole life looking at himself honestly, was dying of cancer, slowly, unfairly young. He was in his early 50s, a young wife, 2 children, an absolutely unjust death by any human logic. And in those final weeks, he had dreams. Jung worked with him until the very end, came in person, recorded every detail. And those dreams were extraordinary. Enormous ships, new horizons, unfamiliar shores flooded with light. Not the feeling of an ending, but of departure. Not darkness, but dawn. Jung said, his psyche was preparing for the crossing the way it would prepare for a great adventure, with curiosity, without resistance, because a person who knows themselves, and that is the hardest work there is, arrives at death like the next chapter, not like a wall. And here is the most stunning part. This man, the one dying of cancer at 50 with 2 children, was calmer in his final days than most people are on an ordinary Tuesday, because he knew what was in his suitcase, and he was not afraid of what he found there. That is the difference between these 2 men, not who they were to other people, not money or reputation, how honestly they looked inward, only that. And Jung repeated this again and again, because he believed it was the only truly important thing he knew. Now, the final years. Because it is there, when there is nothing left to lose and no reason left to pretend, that Jung said things his colleagues would have preferred not to hear. He spoke openly. He saw the dead, not hallucinations. Contact. His wife Emma died in 1955, 6 years before his own death, and Jung said, she comes, not physically, but really. He described it as a conversation without words, consciousness to consciousness, direct, without a mask. And he said, this was more real than most conversations he had with living people throughout his entire life. Because the living are always performing slightly. But there is nothing to perform. You are simply you, completely. And here is something almost no one writes about. After Emma's death, Jung began keeping a journal, not a public one, a personal one. He recorded every sensation of her presence, every dream that included her, every thought that felt not quite his own, as though it had been suggested. Those notes survived. They have not been fully translated to this day, but the fragments that are known, they are striking, not because they are mystical, because they are written with absolute scientific precision. He didn't write, "I felt her spirit." He wrote, "Documented, sensation of informational contact with a pattern corresponding to Emma's personality. Nature of contact, bidirectional. Content, not symbolic, but specific." Do you understand? He remained a scientist until the very end, and even contact with his dead wife he described as scientific data. And still, he published it, because ignoring data simply because it's inconvenient is not science. It is cowardice. In the final months of his life, he dreamed of trees, enormous ones, with roots going so deep there was no visible bottom, with branches disappearing into clouds. One tree came to him 7 nights in a row, the same tree each time, but slightly different, slightly larger. And Jung said, "This is the image of the soul, not a metaphor, an image, the way the psyche shows something for which we have no words yet. The roots, everything that came before you, previous existences, the collective memory of humanity, the branches, everything that comes after, future existences, and you. One moment of that growth, one leaf on a tree that existed 1,000,000 years before you and will exist 1,000,000 years after you. Death is not being cut down, just the falling of a leaf, which becomes part of the soil from which a new leaf will grow." And Jung would add, with that same scientific precision, which kind of leaf you become depends on what you manage to grow inside yourself. While you were still on the branch, what quality of consciousness you developed, what depth, what honesty. That is the seed of what comes next. A few days before his death, June 1961, Jung asked someone to write down a few thoughts. He was already very weak, speaking slowly but clearly. He said this, "Remember it. I do not believe, I know. After death there is something that continues, but that something is not a personality in the way we are used to thinking about personality. It is as though everything you were compressed down to its very essence, and that essence turned out to be part of something enormous, did not dissolve, did not disappear, but became part of it." He didn't call it God. He was too honest to name something for which we don't yet have words, but he said one more thing, and this is what almost no one ever quotes. He said, "The greatest terror is not death. The greatest terror is arriving at death and suddenly realizing you lived someone else's life, that you were always playing a role and never found out who you actually were. And, unfortunately," he said, "that is exactly how most people die. Not from cancer or a heart attack, from having never truly met themselves." He died on June 6, 1961, in his sleep. According to the nurse who was present, his face held an expression of wonder, not fear, not pain, wonder. As though the last thing he saw turned out to be larger than he had expected. And he had expected a great deal. He knew more than any living person of his time about what might be waiting there. And still, he was amazed. Think about that. A man who spent 86 years studying the human psyche and the nature of death died with his mouth open in astonishment, which means there is something there worth being astonished by, which means the reality is larger than any theory, any system, any imagination, however bold. And now, the most important question, not philosophical, personal. Right now, in this moment, what is in your suitcase? Which fears are hiding in there that you call caution? Which resentment are you carrying that you call justice? Which shadow have you been running from for so many years that you've forgotten what you're even running from? Jung said, "The only preparation for death is an honest life. Not a righteous life, not a sinless life, an honest one. With yourself, every single day, because that is the only thing you take with you. Everything else stays here. Money, status, other people's opinions of you. Here, and into whatever comes next. Only what's inside. Write one thing in the comments, one thing you are hiding from yourself, that you know, but won't admit. Not for me, for yourself. Because Jung said, the first step toward the light is naming the darkness out loud. And if you do that right now, you have already begun the only work that matters. The only work you will carry with you.